Welcome to Free Thoughts from libertarianism.org and the Cato Institute. I'm Aaron Ross Powell, editor of libertarianism.org and a research fellow here at the Cato Institute.
And I'm Trevor Burrus, a research fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Constitutional Studies.
Our guest today is Martin Gurri, author of the new book, The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium. Welcome to Free Thoughts, Martin.
Hi.
Maybe let's start with the big term you use throughout your book that you kind of identify as the change we're living through right now, and that's the fifth wave. Can you tell us what that is?
Well, the fifth wave of information is a decisive feature of our moment in time. Industrial age institutions, and by that I mean anything from government to the daily newspapers, are being battered, are finding their authority pretty fatally undermined by an unprecedented torrent of information emanating from ordinary people, the amateurs, the public wielding digital platforms. I call it a wave because when scholars have measured the growth of information from the dawn of culture to today, the chart looks like a tsunami, looks like a tidal wave spiking up at the turn of the new century. The year 2001, for example, produced double the information of all of previous human history. The year 2002 doubled that, and that's pretty much continued along. Now, I call it the fifth wave because there have been four previous great pulses or waves of information in the past. Each one of them sweeping across the social landscape and leaving everything pretty much altered. The first wave was obviously the invention of writing. The second one was the development of the alphabet. The third, possibly the most disruptive, was the printing press. The fourth, into which I was born, was the age of mass media, the industrialization of information. Each one of these waves pretty much entail a reordering of social, economic, and political life. And my sense is that right now we stand at the brink of another potentially catastrophic reordering of society.
And you mean catastrophic in a negative sense or just in the level of change? Would this be as different? Is it going to be as different as the printing press made life, do you think, or as revolutionary as that?
Well, as you probably noticed from my book, I really shy away from making predictions. I was a government analyst, and government analysts are basically your prophets. You're being asked by the president, predict tomorrow to me. That works when tomorrow looks like yesterday, but when you have discontinuities, which is, of course, what the president wants to hear about, he doesn't want to be surprised, it does not work. So I'm not going to be in the prophet business and say this is what's going to happen. But it seems to me that in the past, when we have had these great big pulses, there have been reordering of pretty much from the ground level up of social life, economics, and politics. The printing press being, of course, the most obvious example of that. But I mean, you can go back to the invention of writing, and you had kind of like a priestly, a Mandarin caste that was necessary to handle early writing. And you can go back to the alphabet, and you have the classical republics that couldn't have existed without an alphabet. Each change brought about a reordering. If that holds true, and I'm not saying that it will because I am not a prophet, but if that holds true, we are in for a very unprecedented reordering of pretty much every aspect of life.
Can you give us some examples of how this is playing out right now in our daily lives? Like, what around us are we seeing today that's part of this fifth wave besides just kind of more information being out there?
The fundamental issue that I am interested in has to do less with the surface changes that maybe you're asking about here. You know, how, for example, here we are talking on Skype. Mm-hmm. Okay. I can do that with video, and I have done it. The people who can be in Zurich, Switzerland, they can be in Lebanon, in Beirut, Lebanon. And we can speak directly face to face, literally. I can see their faces. For me, that's always been important. I hated the telephone. The telephone, I always felt left out all the important information, which was a person's face. So I could speak face to face, and it's a very remarkable feeling. Google and algorithmic search, very remarkable. You have a question, out it comes. But my concern is at a deeper level, all these tools have allowed ordinary people, the public, to gather in basically communities of interest. And that interest can be in pictures of cute kittens, or it can be in the overthrow of the regime of Hosni Mubarak, or the occupation of Wall Street to protest capitalism. And this public is now suddenly in command of what I call the commanding heights of information, the information sphere, and can erupt into politics. It is no longer a passive audience. It is no longer a group of people who just stand there and support one elite group versus another elite group. It is itself a player for the first time in history, and has been very disruptive. We can talk about the incidents, but from the overthrow of Mubarak in Egypt to the Indignados in Spain to the tent people in Israel to the Tea Party and the occupiers in the U.S., these are the incidents that I am interested in, that I discuss in the book. Now, as if you read the book, you'll note that it goes beyond politics. Every domain of human activity is challenged. The scientific establishment is being challenged on any number of fronts by people who believe in open science. Bloggers have challenged a lot of global warming, of the orthodoxy. There is a continual struggle between authority, domains of authority, elites that have been taught to believe that they own these domains, that they own this information. Because why? Well, because I spent gazillion years at the university getting these very painful degrees, and then I spent all this time apprenticing in these institutions, and now I'm at the top and I own this information. And suddenly a blogger is questioning what you say, and oftentimes the blogger is right and you are wrong. And there is I guess what I would call a failure of the institutions to make a case for themselves in front of this assault from the public.
Well, it seems like obviously there are two different sides of this. One of them could be that I talked to my journalist friends, the kind of elite people you were mentioning, and I think that they would argue, and some of them do, that the accuracy is a problem with some of these divergent viewpoints that are out there, and probably is the case, or maybe you disagree, that old school journalism was possibly more accurate in general than this new kind of information sharing.
I totally disagree. My area in the government, I worked with the DNI, what eventually became the DNI Open Source Center. I looked at the media throughout the world. The difference was when you put something out in the equivalent of the New York Times or Le Monde or El Mundo or whatever, you were a passive audience, and you were told by the Walter Cronkites of the world, that's the way it is, or all the news is fit to print. And you pretty much had to take it on face value because you had no alternative sources of information. Authority is basically a function of monopoly. The second that monopoly is lost, you have options, you have choices, and there is a lot of, let's say, mediocre information, unanalytically sound information that comes out in what is called new media. It is equally the case with journalism, I think. I think the institutions, this is a very strange contest between people who are probably correct in their assessment of the institutions, which are failing in many ways, but who are not producing any kind of way in which they can be reformed.
I'm trying to think how this is necessarily, or at like a fundamental level, different from what's come before, versus we just happen to be using kind of different technologies to do what we've always done. Because it certainly is not the case that there haven't been popular movements or people organizing around shared interests in the past.
Or even upstart, like things like Thomas Paine Common Sense,
right, or
which was an upstart.
The Protestant Reformation, where the elite opinion was shaken to its core, and similarly with the elites, I mean, I think, look at the way that people engage with information on the internet, and it certainly is the case that people are expressing lots of opinions in a much more public way than they used to, because it used to be, prior to Facebook and Twitter and whatever else, you could talk to the people in your immediate vicinity, but you couldn't kind of broadcast this stuff to the world. But at the same time, this stuff that they're talking about, it's not like everyone – it doesn't feel like everyone's out there kind of generating new opinions and sharing them. It's that they're passing around links to the elites, to a Paul Krugman article or a blog post from some popular blogger who may have gotten to be elite in a different way than in the past, but is still an elite. So is there something? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is there something really different going on here?
You mentioned Thomas Paine. I actually think there are many similarities, and I don't know whether they're just coincidental or there's actually some kind of causal link in there. But I actually think that there is greater similarity between the public of the 18th century that forged the American and French revolutions. That the group of people who essentially call themselves a republic of letters and exchange information about, primarily in the European countries where it was very unsafe to talk politics, about science and data in general, geography, new discoveries, and so forth. In this country and maybe the English-speaking countries, a little bit more of political theory. That public was virtual. It was open to talent. It was not accredited. There were no universities that got you there. There were a lot more women involved in those than there were once the universities got involved. The difference between then and now was that was an elite. That was a very small group of people. Today, if you just look at what happened in Spain with the indignados, one day you are President José Luis Zapatero of Spain writing a wave of popularity. The next day, there are several 100,000 in the street, people protesting not only just your policies, but the system over which you preside. Where did they come from? Who are they? I mean, it is that sort of self-assembly. That's Clay Shirky's term. The ability to self-assemble in gigantic numbers and to maintain a focus, usually against, because these people usually lack any kind of coherent theory. Yeah, you talk about the bandying forth of opinions. This is not about new opinions. This is not about new ideologies. This is about the public being able to gather in unprecedented numbers at the speed of light and be against, essentially batter the status quo. It is a very unhappy public, and it is that way from Egypt to Spain to the Tea Party and the occupiers here, to Venezuela, to the Ukraine. You can go on to Thailand. I mean, it is all over the world. And it's a public that demonstrates certain similar qualities, a certain similar temper, and comes from a very similar demographics. These are not poor people, for example. These are not persecuted minorities. These tend to be university educated, tend to be fairly affluent, and yet they're very unhappy with the system that has made them this way.
You write a lot about how there's a connection between authority and controlling this information, which I think is both in terms of elites, whether or not they're state or not. Walter Cronkite was not a state employee, but still an elite, or the state itself. And in your essay on Cato Unbound that you wrote in response to Virginia Postrel, you write, to a degree that is rarely acknowledged, rulers, individuals, and institutions depend for their survival on the authorizing magic of legitimacy rather than brute force. Legitimacy, in turn, rests on abstractions, divine right, or the sovereignty of the people. Persuasive images embody these legitimizing abstractions. Ideals of authority are given shape and reality and even grace, offering a lucid glimpse of what power ought to be but rarely is. And when I read that, it was hard for me not to think about coming into D.C. and seeing the majesty of D.C. buildings and everything and everything the government puts out to sort of convince us of its authority. Could you expound a little bit more about how this is going to undercut some of those things?
Well, that I guess is the heart of the theme of my book. We tend to think in practical terms. We think of government as great big buildings staffed by tens of thousands of people. you think of authority, the first thing that comes to your mind is maybe a policeman or a soldier. But in fact, this gigantic edifice largely depends, and that is true in dictatorships no less than democracies, largely depends on the willingness of the majority of the people to accept its existence and to obey its commands. And what I think the conditions of the fifth wave have made possible is an ability to erode that legitimacy, because every time the government makes a mistake today, and that happens all the time for various reasons we can get into. But before, in the old industrial age, when you made a mistake, you either, if you were a politician, you could be, voted out, and the system was not implicated, or it got discreetly put aside, and in the end, people decided not to talk about it, or they framed it in a way that was not corrosive. Today, when the government makes a mistake, all these waves of the public that I have mentioned tend to dwell on it almost obsessively. In fact, government is made to be the sum of its failures. And that is very erosive of democracy. And that has happened here and in all the old democracies, as well as in authoritarian countries.
This erosion of legitimacy and authority, you talk about it as, this erosion of the legitimacy and the authority of these big institutions or these elites. But is there a sense in which it's just an erosion of legitimacy and authority, period, such that they're just that this kind of public popping up and being able to get mad at things and dwelling on things undercuts the possibility of authority at all, such that we kind of just smear everything out to the same level of truth value or lack of it, which doesn't necessarily seem like a good thing?
Yeah. I don't think we're there, but I think my concern is a figure I bring up in the book is the figure of the nihilist. The nihilist in my mind is the logical conclusion of the path that I was just describing, of basically a public that is focused entirely on negation, on denial, on repudiation, on criticizing, without feeling incumbent upon itself to propose alternatives. And the nihilist, very simply, is the person who believes that the destruction of the status quo is a step forward, it's progress. You don't have to come up with an alternative. And that person has, you can get hints and glimpses of that person today. And if you read some of the pronouncements and the proclamations and some of the demonstrations that have erupted around the world, you can get hits and signs, but we're not quite there yet. But my concern is that is the direction we're headed in.
So, as a concern, though, because that's where I see some criticism here, of the blogosphere, that we are living in a world now where people have increasingly private facts, private knowledge, entirely private opinions about various things, whether they're David Icke lizard people believers or vaccine skeptics or the global warming sides. You mentioned that previously. Right. There's just they each think that the other side is completely insane. So does that make the populace sort of ungovernable on some level if they just are there's nothing where they can meet in the middle?
I actually think as long as you have these communities of interest kind of rolling along with their little obsessions, whether they're governable or not, you can survive. My concern is it's much more that every once in a while you get some spark, and that's a pretty mysterious thing. What causes that spark? Okay. I don't think it's predictable, but it suddenly becomes a shared point of reference where a whole lot of these communities that you were just mentioning cohere into a group, and they're all angry at authority in a very united and very antagonistic way. And then suddenly there are 300,000 people on the streets of Madrid or Tahrir Square in Egypt or in Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, anywhere. And suddenly the government is presented with this problem of how do you deal with exercising authority, the will to command, when basically the public is less and less willing to obey.
Do you think this is extension of 20th century sort of postmodern thought to something, or just a continuation of it? Because thinking about how different institutions, different writers in the 60s, for example, like Howard Zinn, came in to say that the people's history of the United States was much worse than George Washington throwing a silver dollar across the Potomac, and all these myths about how great these people were. And that's a lot of what the 60s radicals were doing. America's not as great. The myth, the narrative is wrong. And that's been a big progression of a lot of movies and literature in the post-war era, maybe all of us being a little bit pessimistic after World War II, or whatever you want to chalk it up to. And now we're just ramped that up on steroids and gave everyone a smartphone to figure out their own little narrative against the prevailing myth.
Well, I mean, I'm a 1960s guy, and I lived through a whole lot of that, and there was a whole lot of crap being thrown around in those days, no question about it. But I think the situation is somewhat different than that. I think the situation is more that as long as you control the means of communication, which in the industrial age, the elites totally did. I mean, when I grew up, I had literally, I don't know, how old are you guys? Let me ask you that.
In our early 30s.
Mid-30s.
Okay.
Mid-30s. As of yesterday, yes.
You guys have, happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
You guys have no clue. I grew up with 3 channels in television, and that was it. Okay, that was what there was. When Walter Cronkite told me that's the way it is for this particular day, after having given me, 25 minutes with 3 reports, mostly of pictures, and the entire world had unrolled for those 24 hours, and that was all there was, those 3 reports. All I could do was turn to other 2 channels who gave me more or less the same thing, only in a lot less magisterial way, okay? As long as you have the control of the means of communications, you can maintain your narratives that legitimize authority. And that's true for government, it's true for even dictatorial governments, but of course it is true for democracy. And the problem comes when you lose your monopoly of information, when there's an alternative voice that says, no, that's not the way it is. There's a very different world out there from the one that you are telling us. And I think what progressively with the fifth wave, under the conditions of the fifth wave of information, more and more voices have been saying, no, no, no. And every once in a while, these voices cohere into a very large public of opposition that can self-assemble and can essentially overthrow established regimes. And every narrative is a mixture of facts. And you said myth, but no, it's really speculation. All right. So if you're Osama bin Laden way back when, and you say, well, why has Islam declined? Well, the decline is given. That's a fact. He accepts that. Then he says, well, I think it's because we're not as faithful to Islam as we used to be. Well, that's speculation. So you look at that and you say, well, he's right about the history part, but the rest of it seems bizarre. Why would it? So if you're inside of a narrative, the speculative part of it, I guess you would call it a myth, is very easy to shoot down. And I think that is what you have. If you have a monopoly, it doesn't happen. If you have the fifth wave of information where the public basically commands the means of communication, it not only happens, but it happens ferociously. There's a love of knocking down the other guy's narrative. And as you know, when I was a young man, I always felt that the best way to learn about a religion was from another religion's point of view. All the warts come out, right? Well, I think that's what happens when you have this condition. Every narrative, in the end, is made to seem absurd and collapses under its own weight.
And that does seem very, though, in the postmodern vein, at least, of being suspicious of narratives that are just sort of told to keep the powerful in power or keep some elite in the elite status. That's the point of a narrative.
See, I don't believe that. No, number one, I really don't like terms like postmodernism, partly because I don't understand them, but mostly because they sort of are laden with judgmentalisms, and I actually think narratives are essential to human life. That is the way we communicate information the most effectively. Like I said, I studied this, and it's actually demonstrable that if I start throwing numbers at you, pretty soon your eyes are going to cross and you're going to stop listening to me. But if I tell you once upon a time, I got you, you're paying attention. And I will put something equivalent to the numbers I wanted to give you in that once upon a time story, and you'll get it, okay? And all the great civilizations, all the great governments, systems of governments, all the great religions, they depend on stories. And I don't think that's necessarily, when you look at yourself and you wake up in the morning, you tell a story about yourself. I'm this kind of a person, right? And you kind of aspire to the story that you tell yourself. It's not necessarily something manipulative. It can be, but it is not necessarily. It's necessary. And if in a world devoid of narratives, I'm not sure what would look like. It would look like a world devoid of organization.
Is that the world we're heading to, though? Because what you've described is, the publics like to knock down narratives. That's what these groups seem to do. And even if I don't participate in that knocking down, if I see enough of it over and over and over again, I'm going to start to become very skeptical about the next narrative that comes along. Yet at the same time, and I think you're right, narratives are an extremely central feature of human beings. It's how we think about the world. It's how we think about our lives. So does this kind of explosion of information and decentralizing of authority mean that the world then is moving in a direction that's not really compatible with us?
I think we're moving to a world that in which it's going to be very difficult to manage structures of command and control. It's going to be very difficult to organize, for example, a democratic vote. It's going to be very difficult to somehow come up with compromises between opposing points of view, because all those things happen within shared narratives. I mean, democracy has a large narrative itself. The American narrative, for example, you want to talk about a speculative or a mythical narrative, talks about the fact that we're all equal. Well, okay, I'm a big baseball fan, and I look at Bryce Harper, and I go, well, I'm not equal to him. Okay, that guy is a monster when it comes to hitting the baseball. And that applies to every domain. There are people who are very good. But in America, we say that doesn't matter. There's a moral aspect in which we are all equal. And I fully believe that. But if you're standing outside of that narrative, it looks very foolish. And I think political compromises in democracies happen within these narratives. And I think that's going to get progressively more difficult. And not just compromises, but even organizing a program, reforming the system, changing anything, moving in any direction, it's going to become progressively more difficult because basically the nakedness of the emperor is always going to be very visible to the public.
It seems like you might therefore just be chalking up some of the last 2 years in Washington stagnation type of issues as an inability to share a narrative because everyone's had their narratives destroyed and rebuilt, but no one is sharing the same narrative.
Well, it's kind of funny because I have noticed that President Obama likes the idea of narratives a lot. I'm not sure he has a clue what he means by that, but he talks that up a lot. I actually think, Washington. I live in Washington, and I worked in Washington my entire life, and God prevent me from trying to explain it. Okay. But I actually think if you're going to try to come up with an analysis of the last few years and the level of inaction beyond the obvious fact that the politics are divided so equally that it's hard to get anything across from one side to the other, I think the fact that the president himself, Barack Obama, has taken a turn that is probably quite different from that of any other president I'm aware of, that is very consistent with the attitude of the public. And we can talk about that a little bit if you want.
What you mean? You think that he is merging with the narrative?
Basically, President Obama, after his electoral defeat in 2010, went back to being what I consider to be his true voice. Between 2008 and 2010, he was sort of LBJ. He was sort of FDR. He wanted to foster these big programs to solve these big problems. But the real Obama, the one that existed before that, was essentially a man who was against. He was against the Iraq War. He was against the Democratic establishment that Hillary Clinton represented. And of course, he ran in 2008 in complete repudiation of the Bush legacy. In 2010, he sort of assumed that voice, where he became essentially accuser-in-chief, is what I call him. He became somebody who felt that his job as an old community organizer was to point, for example, that people were trampling on women's rights or that our economic equality was declining. And while presidents in the past have made these sort of charges, that's usually in preface to, and now this is what I intend to do about it. Here is my program to solve this issue. And that's what never happens with this administration. He is really a sectarian prophet. He just wants to, he seems to find his job in pointing attention, being a voice for the wrongs that he sees in society, versus that somebody who's an expert in policy or programs or even politics. I don't think he's a particularly adept politician.
I wanted to shift gears a bit to the Arab Spring specifically, because in the first part of your book, you spend quite a lot of time talking about the uprisings throughout the Arab world and use them, specifically Egypt, to kind of show how a lot of these things play out, how the public can become very quickly organized around something, how social media plays in. You talk about the role of imagery in provoking these things, and then how governments try to address this fifth wave change often very badly and only make things worse. So I was hoping maybe you could tell us a bit of that story, because I found it pretty interesting.
Well, basically, if you move to Egypt to begin with, you have a movement that began as a Facebook event. Okay, a young man, he was 29 at the time, called Wael Ghonim, set up a Facebook page called "We Are All Khaled Said." Now, Khaled Said was, he was a person, he was an event, and he was an image. He was another young man who had been very brutally beaten to death by basically the thugs in the employ of Hosni Mubarak's regime. What transpired with his particular case was that his family went to the morgue and secretly took cell phone photos of his incredibly mangled appearance. And the contrast, he was a very handsome young man, and there are photos of him smiling, and the contrast between this handsome young man in his living photos and this horrible image was basically the centerpiece of the We're All Khaled Said Facebook event. In that page, he invited, for Police Day in Egypt, January 25, people to come out to Tahrir Square in Cairo. There were 1 million people who viewed that, and there were 100,000 that said, yes, I'm going to show up. Now, whether they did or not, that's a mystery. But the fact is, when he showed up, he lived in Dubai. That's another thing. He didn't even live in Egypt. He lived in Dubai. He was marketing head for Google, and he was conducting this revolution in Egypt from another country. He did go to Egypt. He showed up, and there were, of course, the crowds had arrived, and very much once the movement hit the streets, took a life of its own. Part of the reason he had scheduled that demonstration for January 25 was what had transpired in Syria, where another young man called Mohammed Bouazizi had essentially felt himself humiliated. He had been insulted by a woman in the employ of that particular authoritarian government, of a man called Ben Ali. And he was so distraught that he doused himself in gasoline and burned himself alive. And there are photos of that. Just two images out of Khaled Said and Mohammed Bouazizi that stand at the origin of the Arab Spring. And of course, 3 weeks after the demonstrations got started because of this event, the dictator in Tunisia was gone. this in turn inspired the Egyptian Wales going to try the same thing in Egypt on Facebook. It worked. Basically, none of these sort of self-assemblies of the public would have been possible without the conditions of the fifth wave. All of them appeared to the people in authority to be like suddenly a materialization of people from nowhere. Suddenly one day there was nobody, another day there are 100,000 people on the square. In fact, they were all planned pretty carefully and at length on Facebook or other digital platforms. It's just that the hierarchies of government tend not to pay attention to that. Those are not important outlets. So I think part of what the clash that the Arab Spring illustrates, and that, of course, the same thing happened in Syria, where the conditions were different. You had no access to mass media there because the government was far more totalitarian. But they could put out YouTube videos of the crowds and the size of the demonstrations. You could tell these were very large crowds, and then you could put out YouTube videos of the repression, so you could tell the bad things were happening there. So there was no way that governments, even an aspiring totalitarian government like Bashar Assad's in Syria, no way that he could close the borders to information. I think the information sphere is larger than any government. And of course, in Egypt, Mubarak tried. I mean, this is an old man's mistake. He thought that if he switched off the internet somehow or another, the demonstrations would lose their voice. But the information sphere, part of the point I make in my book, this talk of new media and old media, it's useful at a certain level. But what really matters is the fact that all of these media have matrixed into a gigantic and redundant sphere, and it's completely out of the control of any government. So switching off the internet really did very little in terms of taking away the public's voice.
And if you compared that to Tiananmen Square in China in 1989, you see a very different story, because there the information was controlled and then squelched, and it wasn't democratized in that way.
The Chinese had walls, if I remember correctly. They had walls where they would post their proclamations. And they were a little bit like blogs, I guess. But they were literally physical walls. And of course, if you are a policeman, you can see what's being put on the walls, and it is not a big mystery. And I mean, the Chinese government during the Tahrir Square uprising filtered out the word Egypt from its You could not.
You mean the Egyptian government during the Tahrir Square?
No, I mean the Chinese.
Oh, you mean the Chinese in China? Okay.
Yeah, the Chinese. If you were a person in China and you wanted to search on Egypt, you could not. They considered that to be a very alarming thing that was happening there. I mean, the Chinese are on the brink. They are on the brink. All the things that I'm talking about are events that have happened, and I am not prophetic, so I'm not going to say they will happen here or there. But if you look at what the Mubarak regime was not that much more incompetent than the Chinese regime. All these governments are on the brink.
So is there anything inherently libertarian about this? I mean, libertarians are going to be pretty excited about anything that undercuts state authority, but that doesn't mean that anything that replaces it is going to be necessarily better or less authoritarian. But so should libertarians be generally happy about these developments? I have been kind of surprised by how the book has been so well received by libertarians. I'm sort of like a man without a label. Unfortunately, I always find reasons to argue with myself. So whenever I think I'm something, I end up being something else. So I am not a libertarian, and the book was not particularly intended as a libertarian tract, but it speaks to the failure of government. And it speaks to the fact that government is failing in a very open way. In the past, government could fail much more discreetly than today. And it speaks to the self-organization of the public. And in the past, the public found it impossible to organize without a structure, without a hierarchy, without a mass movement or a party of some sort. And I guess those are, as I understand libertarianism, which I mostly don't, I guess those would be sympathetic to that point of view. I think in the end, you have to replace something with something. My concern is that we're trying to replace something with nothing, and I don't know how that could be. And that's sort of the way that
the trend of a very negation-obsessed public and a very failure-prone government, that collision between the two where we're headed.
Well, perhaps one of the lessons is that more mass centralization or centralization of many groups of people together who have many access to different information, different narratives, different types of information. It's not going to work if you try and get them all to centralize together, but maybe they can govern themselves on a smaller level, possibly.
I think that is absolutely the case, and I think that there's a book called "Seeing Like a State" by a very brilliant
James C. Scott.
Yeah. I mean, that's a brilliant book. Okay, and many of my insights were frankly stolen from his, because once you think it best, there's no point in getting any better. And I think he describes what he calls a high modernist temper, which is what you say, is centralizing, is programmatic, is everything under a gigantic umbrella. And we deal with these huge, what they call problems, which are really social conditions. For example, economic underdevelopment or unemployment. That is, to call it a problem makes it sound like a mathematical equation. In fact, it's just a condition. But there's some gigantic, colossal expenditure of political power, theoretically bringing in scientific know-how that's going to, quote, solve this problem. That's high modernism at work. We have inherited that rhetoric. I mean, we are way beyond high modernism. Nobody believes in much of that anymore. But our rhetoric, our political rhetoric, it still speaks in terms of those gigantic problems and gigantic solutions. Obama very much talked that way. So did Bush. And I think, yes, the first step towards good health in a democracy is to step away from this gigantism and to understand that most knowledge happens in the personal sphere, happens locally. Most direct causal effects happen in that sphere. When you're dealing with governments at the level of the hundreds of millions of people, unintended effects almost always swamp whatever your intentions are. When you're dealing with yourself as an individual or your community as a small group, where you're face to face and you know that if there's a job opening, you can apply for it and you get a job. So that is a very direct cause and effect. If we have a 7% level of unemployment and there is a program to fix that, you have no idea how that works. What are you to do about that? You're basically swamped by unintended effects. And if you look at, if I may plug another book that I think is fundamental and has not gotten nearly enough play, brilliant book called Why Most Things Fail by Paul Ormerod, a British economist. Basically, he makes, among other things, a very brilliant statistician. He makes a really excellent statistical case that almost everyone, at every level of human life, we mostly fail, all right? But at certain levels, we can do trial and error and kind of correct that. But the problem with government is that it accumulates failure. It's a system that accumulates noise and becomes more and more fragile as it does that, because to accept failure is political death. So you have the system that fails constantly and is unable to move beyond that.
Thank you for listening to Free Thoughts. If you have any questions or comments about today's show, you can find us on Twitter at FreeThoughtsPod. That's Free Thoughts, P-O-D. Free Thoughts is a project of libertarianism.org and the Cato Institute and is produced by Evan Banks. To learn more about libertarianism, visit us on the web at www.libertarianism.org.